Good day, colleagues, and welcome to Fluid Conversations, a platform where we invite global thought leaders to share their views of how we're doing presently in the global environment and the local environment, and what does the future hold. Today, we have a really special guest. He's an economist. He's the director and head of research at Nason's Advisory. He's a regular commentator on the political economy in South Africa, in Africa, and globally. More recently, he's been an advisor to government on human settlements, water and sanitation matters. It is my pleasure to welcome columnist, commentator, and part of the new Global Conscience, Antti Pai. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Tizganas. I'm very, very happy to join you.
Perfect. So let's kick right into it. The first thing that I think we need to engage is this concept of globalization, because it's been the subject of an intense debate almost everywhere in the world. In fact, it's now part of the new phenomenon in the US presidential campaign, as it is in many of the other elections that are happening around the world in 2020. And embedded in this is an interesting irony, because 20 years ago, we were talking about globalization and the marginalization of the global South. Now we have the president of the most powerful economy of the world claiming the same, that the United States is also being marginalized by this new globalization. How big a challenge is this, or are we looking at it the wrong way?
Look, I think it is a great challenge because it happens, as many people have commented, globalization has brought prosperity to billions and billions of people in the world. It has lifted many people out of poverty. There's no doubt that we can see that in places like China, for example, that upon its manufacturing and exporting to the world, and that taking advantage of the global village, they've been able to lift up millions and millions of people out of poverty. So that is clearly there are some good examples in that. And I think it's also quite true if you look even in, on the African continent, where, for example, if we think about the countries that have been able to sell some of their produce in the rest of the world, there have been some improvements in terms of that. So certainly it has brought improvements. But at the same time, it has brought, and I think it is very, very clear and it's very stark, in terms of the inequalities that it has created within nations, and certainly also amongst nations themselves. I mean, I think if you look at the European example, for example, you see that, in the EU of the 28 countries, almost over a quarter of production sits in one country, which is Germany. And so you have the lowest unemployment, and everybody else has struggled along. And you see everybody else then having to migrate to places, like the UK and everywhere else. So certainly you can see that it has created inequalities, and certainly people are starting to revolt against that and saying, look, this is no way to actually to live our lives. So we see this, what now we call nationalism, where the British people are saying, this migration that we are seeing, because we are all part of one, trade village, one global village, is not working for us. We want out of this thing. And you've seen it with Brexit. It's a similar thing that you see in the United States, of course, with the election of Trump and the Mexicans and the wall. And in South Africa, certainly with what we call xenophobia, but it's, I think we misname it because certainly it's not something that is just South African, it's everywhere else. So it is clear that the inequalities that it has caused, some of the disenfranchisement that many people feel has brought to them is a challenge.
Let me ask you the question a little more directly. Is it simply that those who had before and expected to continue to have now crying foul because the globalization project has actually been successful around bringing more players into this global economy?
There's absolutely no doubt about that, because clearly this is what was being taught. I think the big players, the big powerhouses wanted this, and they said, look, all of us must open up. They certainly told us, and in the South African experience, we know that we were told when we came into democracy, open up your borders and it will bring prosperity. And to some extent it has. And certainly now that we are competing and actually it is achieving exactly the outcomes that they wanted, it is not doing quite as well as they actually had believed it would do as well for themselves. because actually it is actually a steward who could not plan it as perfectly as they hoped that it would be planned.
But whatever our views on globalization, whichever side of the fence people fall on this, there is a new single-strand RNA retrovirus that has said the world is indeed global. This is COVID-19, right? And we've all been plunged into a crisis. Crisis in the health domain, crisis in the social domain, and the crisis in the economic domain. And we have now seen unbelievable contraction everywhere in the world, absolutely everywhere in the world. So what are the implications for this, for the near term as well as the long term, for the world, for this continent, and indeed for South Africa?
I think what is interesting, globalization, of course, is something that has been going on since before the World War. And I think in World War II, it represented quite a disruption, because suddenly when people go to war, they look inwards, they look for resources inwards, they look for work inwards, how they can actually eat inwards, except maybe for those who call themselves, allies, then they may share here and there. And I think that has been an interesting thing, because as we saw it here, that same disruption in which suddenly we had to close our borders because we were actually under threat of this, and as many people have called it, a war. But interestingly, it has also taught us something important, because it said when we closed our borders, we realized how vulnerable we are because of globalization, that our production processes and our value chains depended on open borders, not on closed borders. But that also is something that we did because we were talking about cost competitiveness. But we never actually imagined the risk that it actually posed to each and every one of us. So, cost competitiveness is one thing where you can actually have your medical equipment manufactured elsewhere cheaper so that you can have it. But it's got another when you realize that you need to have a manufacturing capacity in your own country for the purposes of defending yourself against a virus like this one. And so many people have now realized that it was not all a good idea, that we should depend on the so-called, competitiveness, or, whether it's relative or in absolute terms, depending on where you are in the world, that actually you do need to produce something domestically. And I think that's an important thing, because then it asks us to do something very different about how we actually imagine the world, how we imagine the economy, and the principles under which we work. So the principles of competitiveness and, the price only being the main thing. So let's shift everything to China and then bring it back because it's good for consumers who can now afford cheaper goods. And they can eat cheaply, then we can get cheaper medical equipment, and that when the borders close. And of course, if we, as everybody knows, we are going to be in volatile situations for time to come because there is this competition. So that means something important, that actually we need to readjust our infrastructure in terms of how we produce and how we protect ourselves. And I think that's going to be very important going forward, because COVID-19 brings this back very, very starkly. So that has implications both for Africans, for South Africans, and everywhere else in the world. And I think a very good quote actually does come from the World Economic Forum that says countries need to rethink this thing now in terms of risk rather than just competitiveness.
Okay, but let's examine this thing, because it gets a bit confusing, right? On the one hand, there's been this incredible disruptor, right? It has brought an economic downturn that we simply cannot deny anywhere in the world. Is it actually possible to have an economic recovery without a reinvestment in globalization? A different model, perhaps, but a reinvestment in globalization? Or can it be, as we've been seeing on the campaign trails, that just the nationalist projects in different parts of the world is going to make this happen?
Well, I think the important thing is actually to think about that word recovery, right? Because actually to recover from something is almost, you were one way and you go back to the way you were. So, if you had been a little bit ill and you were lying in bed, now you're going to get up and walk again and you go back to your previous life. I think that is no longer in the offing, because obviously things have changed dramatically because of the lessons we have learned now. So if you were thinking about, as I say, if you're thinking about how you have managed your manufacturing, you have to do it differently now, because clearly for the purposes of managing the threats and the risks in the world that we see, you want to make sure that some things, if you are smart, must be produced here at home. But secondly, that there are industries now clearly that are not coming back. This discussion we would have been having at an office environment at the moment in close proximity. That's not likely to happen anytime soon because people are now finding new ways of doing this. So think about the property sector. That sector is no longer going to behave the way it used to. We know also because of the fact that people now need less space. Many people say, I only need 60% of the land that I was using or 6% of the office space that I'm using. You can think about tourism. Tourism is going to change, right? Because there will be some fears going forward for some time. So people who are in tourism have to find new ways of doing tourism because this is not going to be the same going forward. If you think about, obviously, and Izoan is the IT sector, right? There is going to be more innovation. I mean, we are using an American system here. It should be possible to use local systems that bring us closer to talk to each other. There must be some ways in which our young IT gurus can bring us as platforms. And so that means an opportunity in the IT sector and telecommunications in particular. So clearly the world has changed in that sense. So if we think about a recovery, how are you going to make people in the property sector recover, in tourism recover? So we're not talking about a recovery now. They must re-engage the way they do business completely. And I think that's important. So wherever we think about it, I think we have to say, how do we re-engage in a way that's useful? I think even, for example, for labor unions, they have to think differently because clearly there are jobs that they've represented, including when we think about climate change, which is, I think, our next COVID-19 disruption is already here anyway. But certainly, again, they have to think about that because people now are thinking about new ways of being, of energy. So how do you actually re-engage? So a recovery is not something I think we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about how do we reimagine this thing and how do we rework it so that it actually works better for everyone.
One of the things that's consuming everyone in the world, every nation state, every bloc, is building these economic recovery strategies. And I think you may be right that some of them are tilting in the wrong direction, trying to get back to where they were before, which wasn't so great in the first place. Yeah. But whatever that is, this enterprise is going on. In your view, does water as a resource have the right positioning in the discourse that's happening around economic recovery or building a new economic model?
I think it doesn't because one of the things that you hear all the time and really is about the way things have always been. I think what we've heard, even, where we think in South Africa and the National Treasury, how do we reimagine a new water sector? How do we invest in water? I think it's still difficult to imagine new ways of investing in water. It's still very, very difficult to imagine because we know only the big ways of investing in water, big projects and big dams. I was hearing yesterday about the big discussions that are still happening in water about, the big investments and how you bring in big money to that. But certainly in the context of, a changing world and changing needs, and certainly in the context of the way money is going to move around in the world, the money is already moving around in the world, and how we actually are setting up our households and our buildings and our workplaces, even the way we set up water and how we deliver water to people has to change. I just imagine, in the area of Sentin, for example, all of those buildings, if I think about all those buildings, if you need only 60% of that space, of the new buildings that have come up there, some of the 60% there is going to have to be residential. And you provide water differently to a residential space than you do in an industrial environment. And somebody needs to think about that and say, look, if we've thought differently about people now, maybe we're going to have to use some of those buildings to help to bring in people to live, because we know, of course, we have all these special problems. Then clearly we need to think differently about how water is going to work in that area, and of course, sanitation. So clearly, it's not something that we are thinking about. We are still forging ahead, and there will certainly be people who think we need big projects to deliver big, employment opportunities and big money and big investments. But actually, perhaps we need smaller projects, smaller money, so that actually we deliver in more nimble ways going forward. And I worry that certainly we are still very much stuck. I was listening yesterday to some of the discussions that are happening in the economic partners at NEDLEC. And the economic recovery plan is not very different to the plans that we've been having for a very long time. as if actually nothing has changed. And many, many things have changed. And we are not going to be able to go on as the president has been indicating over the past few months, even as we have been going through COVID and the so-called post-COVID world.
There seems to be a lost opportunity that is standing right in front of us, about to disappear. I mean, we're talking about a big shift in the paradigm, which means a big shift in the number of players, a big shift in the profile of those players, because now we're talking about smaller systems, smaller water systems, smaller wastewater systems. Doesn't that offer an incredible opportunity to engage with the big South African project around actually making the economy more inclusive?
It absolutely does. And I think, one of the interesting things about that, if you think about just in the space of, human settlements, the way people live, right? Because if the way we live changes, we work changes, the way we live is going to change. And we are seeing, whether or not we're going to be building not so much the very densified areas. Maybe we need to open up a little bit more space, or maybe we need to densify more. Whatever the model that we come out with will work. Before we wanted to be in spaces where everybody must come to center. Now we can actually know that we've got spaces everywhere else, and therefore, why should we transport water to all these very places when we could actually have water systems, as you say, in the localities where people are, and use new technologies? And those technologies can be built by locals. As I said, remember that now that we realized that we have actually been putting a lot of things at risk because of the fact that we've been importing everything, all our technologies, that if there were to be a next war, we would have to now still, bring in parts for energy, bring in parts for water, bring in parts for sanitation, instead of actually manufacturing them here at home to keep our people safe and actually, relatively self-reliance, because the self-reliance is going to be important going forward. So certainly, how do we actually disaggregate the world? Now, as I say, part of the problem that we have is that we're still very much in the macro environment. We like big solutions that will come down to everybody, instead of actually solutions that can be found amongst the people and where people are, so that actually they're much more nimble. And therefore, actually, you make it much more so-called inclusive. Remember, I'm against the word inclusive growth, because in many ways, you actually say, let's first grow and then include other people. Actually, it must come from the fact that people are included. So if you were actually creating a water system, that water system has to be created by the people who need it and actually be familiar with it and meet the needs where they are. So people who are in Libo, for example, should not have an open dam in a space where maybe we see the climate is not such for an open dam. There must be open dams in other areas where actually the climate is such. So we have to actually design solutions where people are for the people and by the people, as it were, almost democratizing the economy. If we can do that, I think we'll do much, much better. And we actually will include people in there going forward. And that's the opportunity we've got. But it seems, as you say, we are going to lose it soon.
Let me explore the other dimension of that, because you're talking about a big transition around how we're thinking about water and water provision and water infrastructure going into the future. But there's another dimension that is traditional in the water industry, and that's around being public service owned and driven almost exclusively. And it's quite clear now all over the world that, one, there isn't financing available to sustain that model in the first place. And secondly, the management model associated with that have a few examples of brilliance in the world. We must acknowledge the likes of Singapore, the likes of Japan, but they're very few. By and large, we have a ballet. So there's a need for a much more robust partnership, if you like, with the corporate sector, with the business sector. Is this possible? And if it is, what are the models that will drive this?
Very, very interesting. In South Africa, we've had, and this is something I've been thinking about, whether in the new environment we need new solutions or a mixture of new solutions and old ways of doing things. In South Africa, we have a model called the Stokvel model, which is the societies or groups of women in particular would get together, put money together to save for a particular end. So they would usually save for the end of the year for groceries, and they'd put that money together. Some of the money they would lend to each other, or they would lend to other people. And then at the end, they collect the interest and they grow their own money to be able to meet a particular end. Now, I thought this was an interesting thing because, as we know, the energy sector itself is changing. You can think about solar panels that everybody can now buy to put on their roofs and what energy they could share. So they could use their money actually to save for their energy, which would be much more stable energy because, right, you have your solar panel. You don't have to wait for Eskom or the big conglomerates to actually charge you and increase their prices to refurbish these things. They've got a lifespan of 20 years. The government has already also provided a guarantee for the independent power producers. Now, if we were smart, we would say these women who have savings pools, that savings pool apparently in South Africa is over 20 billion rand. So imagine you could have immediately 20 billion rand into the power sector by power being produced by communities, by women who actually produce their own power, and they can sell the rest to those who are not producing power. So suddenly the inclusive growth argument changes fundamentally, because then we can also think about manufacturing these things here at home. And we use a model of actual money that is much more nimble, that is actually locally collected, therefore has less demands than international money that comes here to be lent to an institution like Eskom. Now you have actually money that is being used from the local base to create local solutions and meet local needs and for local return. And so suddenly you actually have a very, very different paradigm. And I think in water and sanitation, certainly that space is there. We know that, especially in the sanitation sector, where there are new ways of doing things, the new sanitation is a great opportunity for us. For communities, for localized communities, for places where the government is going to take a long time to arrive to provide sanitation, that the locals could themselves put together these systems that work for them, and the water cleaning projects, the sanitation projects, that they can invest in themselves and manufacture themselves and build themselves for their own needs. And I think this is a need that we need to actually think about very, very quickly. But of course, as you know, the big guys and big capital is always interested in finding ways of actually getting involved in that. But I think here's an opportunity now if it is in the energy sector, it should be in the water sector. And remember, as I think you and I have had this discussion before, how do you then create these ecosystems that are particular to the people who live around them and that actually they can own? And we could look very, very differently. And it will solve another problem, the so-called non-payment problem for water and electricity. Because people will be producing their water and their own electricity, why shouldn't they pay themselves for the work that they are doing for their own benefit?
Are there models available, though, to make this inclusivity you're talking about even more inclusive? Because if we organize to bring new players into the system and make that the point of concentration, the threat to the existing players is obviously there, the kickback will be there. And this is part of the reason why, for example, the energy sector has had such a low transformation in spite of the technology being available. So what is the model around including the current captains of industry?
Look, the current captains of industry, cannot be, you can't have it both ways, sadly. We can't have it both ways. So I guess communities and the public will have to agitate for a change, because certainly if they sit back and hope that, whenever I use the word we, I'm always very careful to use that word we, because I actually was reading a paper recently by the IMF that talked about economists tend to actually, adopt political positionings without actually the implications. So the idea of a we, you can say that we as a politician, because actually as a politician, you can change that. So when you talk about that, you talk about agreements with other big politicians. The we are talking about will have to be, in actual terms, individuals and communities that agitate for the changes that they want. I think where, people like myself, economists, have to talk to these things to people so that people wake up to the idea that they can actually do something. So informing society about what is possible. And then hopefully that they then pick it up and actually agitate towards those things. I don't think that it's something that is going to happen naturally. I don't think that is something that you're going to negotiate very well with capital. It's just about communities participating and saying, look, this is how we want to produce our own water. We want to produce our own energy. We want to be responsible for our own sanitation and all the benefits that come with, as we said, new sanitation. So I think in a way it is about talking to people about these things, and hopefully they take it up themselves and say, look, we have an opportunity here and we're going to agitate for that particular opportunity.
Right. So sadly, we're going to have to close. It's been a fantastic conversation, but In your closing, I want to touch on something that I know is very close to you. We've been talking about this for years, about the possibility that countries like South Africa, a continent like Africa, has this possibility of a demographic dividend because of the young people. At the same time, we're seeing that the unemployment rates are overwhelming. And the biggest sector of that unemployment is, in fact, the youth. In fact, right now, with this COVID, we have maybe the highest level of skills unemployed in the world as a whole. So in your closing remarks, do you have solutions for that? Are we able to build the kind of economic model that doesn't allow us to lose this demographic dividend and actually build a better, more sustainable future?
I think it is all about lack of stopping to rely on government. I'm on social media, I'm on Twitter, and I have been surprised by how every single youth initiative wants to include government. So people start something and say, how can government help us? And if government doesn't come along, it doesn't happen. How might we actually engage youth in a different way that says, push something for yourselves. And if government finds you in that, find you along the path towards your own success. It is interesting because actually, people worry about the so-called parallel systems, that, we don't want to create a parallel system to the state because then that's bad for the state. It's not bad for the state. Citizenship and democracy is exactly this, that people can do for themselves and the state can assist wherever by that. I think our young people would do well, to, and the rest of us to support young people to do for themselves and not wait for a government house, a government opportunity, a government fund, a government sponsorship, government, even sometimes government recognition that a minister must come and open this thing for it to actually have any credibility, or it must have a minister's approval, to be able to actually be successful. I think that might be our best chance, because if we wait for politics and for government, nothing is going to happen, because actually they don't know much better than, they don't even know the things they don't know. And certainly that's our problem.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, we've been in conversation with Nkanti Pai, and I think that you will agree with me that he's opened some very interesting vistas to the narratives that we engage on a daily basis. And I'm keen that we bring him back and explore some more. Nkanti, thank you very much indeed. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much.